Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Despite frequent assertions to the contrary, it's not actually true that the government has absolutely no jobs strategy. The state of modern Ireland, and in particular the dramatic reversal of our economic fortunes, has generated quite a substantial industry dedicated to answering the question, lads, where did it all go wrong? I speak as, I hope, a reasonably productive worker bee in that industry, writing weekly about the politics of the bust and how the big bust has affected our politics, and having published a book which attempted to tell what I presumed to call the inside story of Fianna Fáil during the extraordinarily eventful decade and a half of recent Irish history. Nobody ever, I suppose, bought a book that told the outside story. I was briefly the least angry member of a somewhat unlikely sort of journalistic supergroup called the Four Angry Men. My experience in the last 2 years is that much of the literature and the associated windbagging has focused to a greater or lesser degree in identifying who was responsible for the current state of the public finances and the recession in the wider economy. And fingers have been pointed at and knives sharpened for Fianna Fáil, the Progressive Democrats, Bertie Ahern, Brian Cowan, politicians in general, the Department of Finance, the banks, property developers, social partnership, Lehman Brothers, the Euro, other sundry culprits. You can add your own. Politically, the focus of blame has been principally directed at the governments led by Bertie Ahern. I think this is fair enough, and I think it's not inaccurate. But I think if we wish to learn from our mistakes and to chart our way to construct a better republic in the future, then we need at this point to think a little more deeply and a little more honestly about the political failures of recent years. It's beyond doubt that we witnessed a failure in political leadership and in policy making, but why? And why were the programmes offered by Fianna Fáil's principal opponents at elections so very similar to those offered by Bertie Ahern? Why did our politics and political leadership fail us so badly in recognising the dangers that had developed gradually in economic and fiscal policy, in banking and in the property market? And when outsiders recognised those dangers, why was our political system incapable of taking the difficult and unpopular steps to rectify these problems and avert greater catastrophe? Why was that? And I believe that at least part of the answer to these questions is that because this is not what voters return politicians to Parliament to do at all. And I think that to the long list that I iterated earlier of culprits for the economic bust, we need to add another: the voters and the way they vote. Politicians are to blame for the conspicuous and ruinous failure of political leadership. But we should be frank, they share the blame with voters who have elected them on a pretty strict set of instructions. One, that they prioritise looking after the constituency above all else. Two, that they should accede to the demands of whatever interest group is amplified by an uncritical media. And three, that they should never take difficult decisions in the short term for long-term benefit. This is a time for difficult questions, and we must ask them, or we will learn nothing. So ask yourself, what would have happened to the government, the Fianna Fáil PD government, had it introduced a property tax in 2006? How many seats would Fine Gael have won in the 2007 election if it promised to introduce such a measure? Why did Bertie Ahern do an about-turn just weeks before the 2007 general election, over the objections of his finance minister, incidentally, and decide to abandon the previously agreed election strategy of refusing to make big promises? And I think the answer to that question is because he feared the response of the voters to a more modest platform. That he suspected that refusing to make promises, big and small, would have the same sort of effect on his majority that the sea off Donegal has on one's extremities at 8 in the morning. The political parties and individual TDs already know what the academic research confirms. The 2002 election study led by Michael Marsh and Richard Sinnott confirmed that voters believed working for the local area was vastly more important than either performing on the national stage or sharing the views of the individual voter. And politicians have almost internalized these requirements of the voters to the extent that for many, this is all that politics amounts to. These requirements and orders of the voters are all that exists in politics. And the only point of political office is to prostrate oneself before the material desires of the electorate. Speaking in the Senate a couple of months ago, Donny Cassidy offered this definition of his role in life. He said, "In the minds of most, the definition of a good politician, be it man or woman, is someone who can bring the most to their area in terms of schools or other infrastructure." A former cabinet minister once told me that he viewed himself as sort of a chieftain, a local chieftain of old, seeking by his efforts to bring prosperity to his people and his area. It's not illogical or it's not unusual that voters should want their local representative to be concerned with the local area. But pork barrel politics is a fact of life everywhere. It's a fact of political life in the United States, for example. But what is unusual, and I think unproductive, is that Irish voters seem to want their elected representatives to look after the local area almost to the exclusion of everything else. Even their elevation to ministerial rank is seen not just as an opportunity to contribute to national leadership at the highest level, but simply as a way of having a larger say in the diversion of ever larger resources to the constituency. Now, we may be rightly censorious of Irish politicians who cater for and pander to these realities, but we should concede that they are acting entirely logically within the confines of the Irish political and electoral system. Ivan Yates has repeatedly pointed out that the politician who tells his constituents that he can't assist with their medical card application or attend their mother's funeral because he is busy attending to his duties as a legislator and a national leader would soon find himself with plenty of time on his hands to attend all the funerals he wanted. He'd certainly soon be considering the mortality of his own political career. And I think the greatest testament to the truth of Yates's assertions is the behaviour of the politicians who do succeed in being elected. Almost to a man and woman, they are assiduous cultivators of the constituencies, constantly seeking to outdo their rivals, usually in the same party, by the comprehensiveness of their medical card procuring, their headage payment accelerating, their planning permission supporting, their civil service pestering, their welfare application presenting, their funeral attending, their all-round, all-in community service, yours for the price of a vote when the time comes round. These are useful and in some ways vital skills, but they're not, I submit, necessarily conducive to the possession of the skills, the experience and the intellectual capacities which would be useful for running the country. This central assumption of our selection process for the country's leaders, that excellence at this all-round, all-in community service is evidence of the skills and abilities necessary to lead the country is, to my mind, a far-fetched one, and one which I submit that our recent experience would contradict. If we elect TDs to fix pavements and get us medical cards, then that's exactly what they will do. Seen in this light, Jackie Healy-Rae is not just a slightly exotic feature of our political system. In many respects, he is our political system. And his success since 1997 has spawned a range of imitators, with maybe Michael Lowry's current incarnation being the most obvious one. But he will have more imitators. The experience of the 2002 election would suggest that an election following a parliament in which independence votes are essentially bought with the spending of disproportionate amounts of taxpayers' money in their constituencies, that parliament will be followed by a general election in which independent candidates, promising to bring home the bacon, as we say in Clonmel, in a way that party candidates can't, will do especially well. I think we should watch out for a proliferation of independent candidates in the next year, and many of these may be, as to use Noel Whelan's phrase, from the Fianna Fáil gene pool, and I think we've started to see that sort of separation already in South Tipperary with Matty McGrath. I support changing the electoral system, and I think it could bring many benefits. But changing the election system won't work unless people change the manner in which they vote, change the basis of their voting, unless they demand more of their political representatives and more of themselves when making that choice at election time. And on a broader level, I think our political culture, the political culture that we evolved for ourselves in the years of plenty, came to be completely dominated by the idea of giving people what they want as soon as they wanted, and our political parties competed to do that. The practice of social partnership became a mechanism for buying off interest groups, in which the loudest, the largest and the best connected interest group, the public sector trade unions, did best. And the definition of the national interest became simply the sum of the requests of the people sitting around the partnership tables in Dublin Castle. So we reformed our public sector by doubling its pay, only to find out now that it's not really reformed at all. We remade, for instance, the health service, not by reforming it, but by maintaining the power of the consultants and almost doubling the number of nurses, to the extent that we now have fewer senior doctors than most OECD countries, and we pay them more than anyone else in the OECD does. And we have them assisted by almost twice as many nurses as the OECD average. Not a bit more, or a good bit more, twice as many nurses per head of population as the OECD average. And I think that pattern of non-reform is repeated throughout the public service. Sure, we reformed, say, the taxi industry to the advantage of the public and the great disadvantage of the pre-existing cartel. But we didn't touch the big boys with the real power, the doctors, senior civil servants, the law library, the banks. Instead, our political culture refined itself into a mechanism to identify and then mollify and pacify and charm groups of voters, in which leadership was reduced to the ability to offend no one and keep everyone content. The wisdom of "Yes, Minister" rings ever true. It's the people's will. I am their leader. I must follow them. Fianna Fáil understood these mechanics, I think, on a micro and on a macro level. Just as the party greased its own way back into power with tens of billions of taxpayers' money spent to generate maximum political support for itself at strategically opportune moments. So the party understood that many voters judged national politics by what they saw on the ground. One of Bertie Ahern's most senior advisors told me bluntly while I was researching the book that politics is about keeping enough people happy at the right time and taking the shit for the rest of the time. Another senior party figure told me that their instructions to TDs and candidates at election time were simple. He said, if you have to go down and paint the fucking school yourself, then that's what we'll do. The other parties tried to emulate it, but Fianna Fáil, under Bertie Ahern, were the masters at it. They were consumed by an almost manic desire to placate interest groups, from local school action groups to big builders with hands like shovels and borrowings of €1 billion. The practice of government itself was subordinated to the imperatives of politics. It gave us government which was utterly fixated on elections, dominated by the short term, unable to think strategically, and blind to the dangers of shoehorning economic policy into the electoral cycle. In my book, I called it Showtime politics. You could just as easily have called it Ahernism. But whatever you call it, it hasn't served us very well. But Bertie Ahern didn't take power in a coup. He didn't win 3 elections by mysteriously hypnotizing the voters. He did it by convincing the people that he would give them, and was giving them, exactly what they wanted. He did it by understanding that the electorate and giving to them on a national level something that they had always voted for at a constituency level. And until people stop voting for Showtime politics, the politicians won't stop giving it to them. Brecht's caustic assertion that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government was a warning on the dangers of what happens when an elite assumes to itself the moral authority of the people. But just because the people do something doesn't make it right either. Just because voters say they want a particular policy doesn't mean that political parties should compete with one another to give it to them. I should mention all this in the context of accountability and standards in public life, and place my argument in that context, as that's originally what I was instructed to talk about. And while it's tempting, I suppose, to observe that the Irish Times does an energetic enough job worrying about standards in public life for all the rest of us put together, I'll confine myself to observing that I think sometimes we have a somewhat myopic view of what standards in public life is about. Of course, I think that the standards of ethical behaviour in public life are important. Honesty, truth, justice, responsibility. These should be the foundations of our governance. But I also think that standards in decision making and in policy making should be high. Standards of administration should be high. Standards in the provision of services and in communicating with the public should be high. The standards of management in the public service should be high. The standards to which people running the country, from the highest to the most lowly, do their jobs should be high. Because too often it doesn't seem to matter whether they do their jobs to a high standard or to any standards at all. As to accountability, I support the notion, of course, that politicians and everyone else should be made accountable for their actions, though politicians having to ask their employers to rehire them every few years tend to be more accountable in one sense anyway than perhaps bankers or even journalists. But I think that it's a very great failure of the Irish system that politicians make themselves the lapdogs of a public which frequently fails to engage seriously and in detail with serious and difficult issues. I think we have been badly served by a politics that compels politicians to compete in promising the most, in pandering the most, in telling voters that they can have whatever they want without any consequences. Of this type of accountability, we need less, not more. Thank you.